Greetings, fellow alchemists, and welcome to Wordplay Wizardry. Last time, we started our foray into world building, or at least some of the basics, namely land and climate environments. After all, you can't invent a place if you don't know what it looks and feels like. In this episode, we're going to cover something truly exciting. The fantastic world of socioeconomic and political crafting. I know, the stuff of dreams. Look, I don't use sarcasm here to hurt. If you're an economist or a poli-sci major, I apologize. But on the surface, neither of these topics appear all that interesting, at least from a literary standpoint. And maybe they're not even from a general standpoint. However, within that literary context, both of them have far-reaching consequences, depending on what you choose. Because socioeconomic deals with things like money, and the political structure is always more important than just knowing leader titles. One thing I will note is this video will probably be on the longer side, simply because there's a lot of terms and all of them need at least a little description. I could just list the government types and have you go out and research the ones that sound interesting, but a little context will help tremendously. Then you can search that particular term and get a lot more into detail. But for a topic this grand in scope, just naming each one and moving on is kind of like going to a buffet with your eyes closed. You just don't get the full picture. So let's dive in. The socioeconomic factors to consider for your new world are education, income, money, employment, community health and safety, general equality. Some of these will be a little obvious, but I'll define them anyway. Education refers to the level and type of school available to characters in your world. Employment refers to the variety of jobs available to its citizens. Money is the type of currency used. Is it credits, or is it just singular, like a gold coin? Is it more complex, like a modern standard? Income refers to how people are paid and where they keep their money. Are there banks? Do they use safes or community vaults? Or just a box under their bed? Community health is the level and type of care citizens can receive. Is there a complex medical system? Just a doctor? Perhaps a barber surgeon? Are there just clinics? Hospitals? All things to consider. Community safety is overall protection. Things like police and fire control. Are you on the constable system? Sheriffs? Is the law upheld by the military or a militaristic force? Now, compared to the others, equality is less of an institution and more of a state of being. Much like in our world, it deals largely with gender, race, and poverty. How are the different races treated? How are the different genders treated? How are the poor handled? How are immigrants viewed? By defining a lot of this, you also define how characters in your story interact, how they view each other. However, the details don't necessarily have to be in the writing itself, just enough for the reader to understand the world, and some of it might not even be mentioned. Perhaps it's only mentioned in passing, an afterthought. Don't steal that. The constables here are brutal. They'll throw you in the dungeon just for thinking about breaking the law. Just by those two sentences, we know a great deal about the world in question. The police type, the community's feelings about them, their level of care regarding citizens, and the detention type. And in that world, rogues and thieves would have to be particularly brazen and fearless to operate, which is now informing about character. Switching gears, let's discuss the political theater. For the most part, this defines how your world is ruled. It can include a system of rules, and usually does. But a good guideline for that is to start with general laws from our world and add to them. Doing so will save a lot of time. As for the types of government, there are a lot of names here. So, as I said in the beginning, I will give those names and then a brief description. For anything deeper, I recommend going online and researching the finer points. But let's get into it. First up is anarchy, which is a lawless state. Aristocracy is rule by nobles or elites. On the other side of the coin is ergotocracy, which is rule by the working class. As a side note, ergotocracy is a bottom-up type of rule, whereas aristocracy is a top-down type of rule. An authoritarian state is rule through power. This often leads to a dictatorship, which is rule of a single all-powerful figure, which itself is quite similar to autocracy. And yes, those two are quite similar with very subtle distinctions between them. However, we're not going to get into those points here. Just know that they are different, but extremely similar. Moving on. A bureaucracy is less a form of rule and more a system of non-elected management. It relies on the use of departments or ministries, depending on where you're from. By the same token, an algocracy uses algorithms to determine rules and laws and the adherence to them. A bankocracy is a system ruled by the banks. Similarly, a plutocracy is a system ruled by the wealthy, and a corporatocracy is a system where corporations are in charge. Probably not something you'd see in a fantasy world. Conversely, though possibly related, a kleptocracy is a world ruled by thieves. A democracy, meaning rule of the people, involves elected rulers. Similarly, an electocracy is where citizens vote on their representatives, but have no further involvement in the system. Staying in that vein, a republic is rule by the people by way of representatives. For those keeping track, America is a democratic republic, which means we elect representatives to govern on our behalf. Moving on, a geniocracy is rule by the most intelligent. Similarly, a technocracy is ruled by those with technological understanding. In the same vein is noocracy, which is rule by philosophers. A critarchy is rule by judges. A meritocracy is rule by the most talented or accomplished. Similarly, a craterocracy is rule by the strong. A military junta is rule by a committee of military leaders, which can sometimes turn into a military dictatorship or rule by a single military leader. In the military vein is statocracy, or rule by military service. Only those who have served in the military may hold any sort of government office. A monarchy is similar to an aristocracy, but power rests with just a single individual, and does so for life, or until they vacate the job. An oligarchy is a council of rulers. A theocracy is rule by a particular deity, with the church or religion most prominent for that deity being the ones in charge. Now, an ochlocracy is rule by the crowd, or, as you may know it, mob rule. And last, and certainly least, is kakistocracy, which means rule by the least qualified. Now, all of that is governing types, though governing type is different from societal type. So let's get into that. There's several ways to group societal types. The two primary are anthropologically and politically. On the anthropological side, moving from lowest to highest level of society, there's the hunter-gatherer society, where hunters track game and gatherers pick small amounts of edible flora. Pastoral, which is the often nomadic practice of raising domesticated livestock. Horticultural, which is small-scale agriculture. Agrarian, which is large-scale agriculture. Feudal, which involves land ownership versus labor. Industrial, which is the introduction of machinery into the labor force. And post-industrial, which is when the service sector of an economy generates more money than the production sector. There's also three other categories that we need to mention, those indicating the level of technology. They are pre-modern, modern, and post-modern. Using our world as the example, pre-modern takes place between 500 CE and 1500 CE, also known as the European Middle Ages. Modern, ironically, deals with the time period between 1600 and 1800, and postmodern is pretty much everything after 1900. Now, the period before pre-modern is considered the classical period, or ancient history. And unlike the others, which cover just a few centuries, the classical or ancient period covers about 5,000 years. On the political side, moving from lowest to highest level of society, there's band society, which involves small camps. Tribal, which would be more complex than a band society, likely meaning several small villages in one state. A chiefdom, which is where the first centralized leader appears, and that leader governs a more complex and larger society than exists in both band and tribal. A civilization. This is by far the most complex system, and it sees its leader preside over a wider range. This is where states, regions, and territory come into focus. Something to note that as a society moves through the ranks, there's various markers or requirements for doing so. But the most important one is the requirements moving into the civilization. That happens when there is defined territory social stratification or tiers, as well as urbanization, the building of large cities. Another hallmark of a civilization is symbolized communication, aka writing. So, what does this all mean? More importantly, do you need a sociology degree to navigate creating a society? No, you don't. What I've given is a very basic overview, very basic, but it should be enough to give you a good starting point. There's a good chance you may not need to know some of what I've given and may not even use some of it. But how about an example? Just to show you how what we've talked about comes in handy. Let's say you want to write a high fantasy novel. Likely, your society will be agrarian with no major industry. There's lots of farming, so the landscape will have to be flat or have good rolling hills in order to accommodate livestock and crops. That means it's likely temperate with a good mix of temperatures. It also means there's seasons, which gives the beginning of a calendar. The trees for that climate will be largely deciduous, which includes things like oak. This brings up another profession for those without tracts of land, which is timber cutting. Off in the distance, there's mountains that get lots of snowfall. That's a continental climate, and therefore contains conifer trees, such as firs, pines, and spruces. Maybe there's good mining in those rocks. Perhaps all the best metals come from one particular peak. And maybe, because those mines are so fruitful, the workers there carry a lot of power, making that section of society an ergotocracy. Power to the people. The rest of the lands are governed by an oligarchy or monarchy, a council or a king. There's ancient stone structures dotting the landscapes, the last remnant of a society that came before. There's schools, but only basic ones, as the vast majority of people are needed for labor. The best schools are only for elites, the top tier of society. Maybe there's a magic school or two. Regional magistrates employ sheriffs who uphold the law across the countryside. When war comes, they stay behind to protect the land, but they do the drafting of soldiers when there's great need. Doctors are a little scarce, which has given rise to the profession of healers, those who use natural means to cure ailments. Currency is gold and silver coins. The exchange is fairly straightforward, 5 silvers per gold. In terms of prices, a peck of apples is 1 gold, and a gallon of milk is 3 silvers. Already, we've covered education level, money, income and employment, equality, government style, technological level, health and safety, and even brought in some landscape. And this was just a quick example. Relatively speaking, you don't think about the terms, even though they're right in the forefront, because you really only need to say high council and not define oligarchy, something else that we didn't mention, but happens by accident. Because we introduced money, you now have the rise of bandits and thieves, hence the need for the sheriffs. All the pieces come together to make a whole. The difference being, the terms are only necessary to you, because you, the author, have to describe them in your novel. In that way, you can take a base term like oligarchy and turn it into something more literary. a high council of scholars and philosophers, the great sage minds of the land watching over the people. As you can see, the socioeconomic and political structure can still paint a vivid picture. This level of world building fills in the largest gaps to make the world feel whole. How much of this will you need? Well, that's up to you and your story. If you're writing something set in our world, the vast majority of this is already determined. But by understanding it a little better, you can add a bit more depth to your story. If it's an entirely new world, you can see with the example just how vibrant a picture you can create in a short amount of time. Now, you may not need to know the price of apples in your story, but you, the author, knowing allows for a greater understanding of money in your world. It means when somebody offers 100 silvers for a sword or 50 credits for a gun, you know the value of said item, not cost, value, and the audience will as well. They will have a much better picture of what it's like to live in your new society. Which brings us to the end of this portion of the world building process. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, if you'd like to see me expand on something, leave a comment below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you're enjoying what you watch, leave a comment. Until next time, fellow alchemists, take care.